Okay, this one is going to be about rod choice, and it's always a problem. I mean, I go out and teach these classes, and people come up to me and they have all kinds of questions about what kind of rod should I use. This is a longer rod. I'll cast longer. Da 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 da. What's the best rod? So, and I see a lot of stuff on the boards, and most of the information is misleading at best. So there's some questions you have to ask before you decide on what kind of rod you want. And more than likely, even the first rod you buy is not going to be the one that you're going to end up with. I can attest to that. I have more rods than a human needs to have. So what are the questions you need to ask? And I wish I knew these when I first started buying things. So here's the two main questions you have to ask. What kind of fish am I fishing for? And what type of fishing am I going to do? What kind of fish am I fishing for? And how am I going to fish for those? Okay, so let's talk about this a little bit. And I have this broken down in small fish and big fish. Okay, I fish 90% of the time. Yeah, 90% of the time. I'm fishing on the Huron River or up on the Ausable. And the fish I'm catching, are between maybe 10-inch bass, a bluegill around that size, to maybe on occasion, if I'm lucky, like a 20-inch brown up north, okay? That's the range. Sometimes I catch a 20-inch, 30-inch pike. It's a little bit of a challenge, but in general, I'm catching fish in this range. I live in Michigan. That's the kind of fish I'm going to be mostly fishing. So basically bass, bluegill, trout, and any of the other ones that sort of fit into that thing. The other kind of fishing you can do is big fish fishing, like steelhead, salmon. What do I have here? On occasion, if you go to the Caribbean, bonefish and carp. And I do a significant amount of carp fishing if I can get a chance to. These fish are big fish, and you need a lot of, strength. You need a rod with a lot of backbone for that. So that's the first thing to be thinking about. Okay, so let's start with the first question. So what kind of rods are you going to need for this? Okay, let's see. Do I have that on here? No. So in this range, a 5-weight rod is going to do you real good. A 4-weight rod is fine if you're just fishing really small fish almost all the time. But you get a decent sized bass or a pike or a decent sized trout on there, and it's just going to bend that rod right over, and both the fish and you are going to feel it. So really a 5-weight rod is going to be your key there. A 6-weight rod, a lot of people suggest 6-weight rods. I feel they're a little too stiff and not enough fun, okay? Because when you're catching a bluegill or a small bass, I want it to be fun. I don't want to just yank it right out of the water. Big fish, these bigger fish, an 8-weight rod tends to do a good enough job. I've done enough bone fishing and carp fishing, and I've caught plenty of very big fish, very strong fish on an 8-weight rod. Obviously, there's outliers to this. If you're tarpon fishing or, up in Alaska or whatever, I'm talking about a general me and you, Joe, you're going to buy a couple rods. Probably a 5-weight rod here and an 8-weight rod here will take care of 90% of what you're going to be doing, 99% of what you're going to be doing. Now, here's where it gets trickier. What type of fishing am I going to do? Okay, so I've decided I'm going to have a smaller, a 5-weight rod, okay? And I'm going to be fishing mostly for bass. And now I have to decide, am I going to be mostly fishing with dries, nymphs, or small streamers like woolly buggers and stuff, you know. Or am I going to be fishing? I'm going to be a streamer guy, and I'm going to be fishing with these big, you know, these big articulated streamers that are very popular right now. So you have to kind of make a little bit of a decision there. And the reason is because you have to decide on this is where you start really making a decision, okay? If you're fishing those smaller things like the dries and stuff like that, you want a rod with a really kind of flexible tip. And that will help with turning over the fly. It will help with making a gentler, you know, landing. It just in general works better. For these big articulated streamers, you want to jerk those across the stream. So you want something with a very, very stiff tip. I have a couple rods here in front of me, and I just want to show you some of the tips. Now here's a rod with a relatively stiff tip, and if I hung something over this, I mean, I can feel it. It's not going to bend a whole lot. And this isn't even a real streamer rod. There's some rods where this is just not going to flex a whole lot. Sometimes they call these tip flex, but that's not a good term either. You want to look for a rod that has a fairly, for the dries, a fairly strong body, and then this last part should flex quite a bit. Here's another rod that actually does flex quite a bit, and it's much more noodly, okay, at the end. So this would be great for those dry flies, those small nymphs, that kind of stuff. This one is a little bit better suited for streamers, and even some other ones are even stiffer than that, because you want to have control. Every time you move the rod, you want to cause that big articulated streamer to move. Again, most of the time I don't use those kind of flies that often, so the softer rods tend to work for me. And this is kind of why you need to go to a store almost. You know, I mean, you really do need to go to the fly shops and be able to look at the tips and the actions of these rods, okay? That makes a huge amount of difference, a huge amount of difference. So now let's talk about the different brands and all this kind of stuff. Pretty much the major brands have all of those choices. Some are stiff, some are less, and they have names for all of them, and they're going to want you to buy a bluegill rod and a, you know, I mean, it's a lot of it's marketing. A lot of it is very, very precise. I tend to fish for lots of things, so I want a general rod. If I were just like a bluegill fisher, I'm sure I could find an Orvis bluegill rod or a Sage bluegill rod. If you're just, you know, just focused on one kind of a fish. So you're going to really want to, if you walk into the store, say, this is what I'm looking for. I want something with a flexible tip and a stiff body or whatever. Let's just talk just some quick myths. I don't want to go too long on this thing either. And here are just some of the ones that I just see all of the time. Okay, a cheap rod versus an expensive rod. And you may notice that if you go into, you know, a store, they're going to have really expensive Orvis rods and much less expensive Orvis rods, or Sage rods, or almost all of them. They all have different levels. It's a little bit like a car. Whether you have an old a Toyota bottom of the level, or an expensive, you know, a Lexus or something, they'll take you to both of them will take you to the grocery store, okay? It's whether you want leather seats or not, okay, or air conditioning or whatever else. So the big difference in the quality of rods has to do with the metal that your rod holder is. It might be the kind of wood that's here. If this is some rare zebra wood or something, the cork makes a big difference. Whether the cork has not many holes in it, or if it's got a lot of holes in it, and you'll see that. And it's a smoothness, and it's a feel, and it's just nicer. I mean, nicer rods cost more. sometimes it has to do with the finish. Uh, Better rods have nicer, smoother finishes. They'll also have different metal for the line guides, okay? They might have, instead of this centerpiece being plastic, it might be made of some kind of rare agate, okay? So mostly the blank itself, those are pretty similar to the expensive rods and the cheaper ones. So they have just different trim levels, you know. An Orvis, whatever their bottom level one is now, the Encounter or something. I have this is an Orvis Recon, which is kind of the middle version, and you get to the Helios, and they're you know, the rods, the cost of the rods sort of don't make a difference in how they fish, but they make a difference in how you feel. Long versus short. This was a good question. This has been coming up a lot, and I don't know where it started or where it's going. You can cast farther with a long rod, so I want a longer rod, or I want a short rod because I want to get under bushes and stuff. Well, yeah, that's important, but there's some real reasons why you want rods at certain lengths. First of all, you know, you want one from between 8 and 9 feet, and the biggest reason is when you have a 9-foot rod, if you reach out this way, you're reaching out 9 foot plus your arm, 9, 10, 11 feet this way. And when you're reaching this way, it's another 9 or 10. So you got 20 feet of river you can manipulate your line on. When you have a very short rod, and I have a 6.5 foot one, it really limits your ability for mending and stuff. So a long rod really makes a difference more in when the fly's on the water versus how far you can cast. It makes a little bit of difference, but my 6.5 foot, I have a 6.5 foot bamboo rod. I can cast as far as most people can cast with a 9-foot rod. So long versus short. Whether the rod can cast long, a lot of people will take out a new rod and they'll cast like, a bazillion miles. Well, if most of your rivers are 20 feet wide, that's not going to be a big issue. And the other thing is when you start casting much more than 30 or 40 feet, you lose a lot of ability to hook the fish or do a lot of things with the fish. So long casts are almost the least important thing in fly fishing, unless you're bone fishing, then you got to cast a million miles of carp. So most of the time, what you want to do is you want to see how well that rod casts at about 20 feet. I think that's probably the bulk. And if you can do that, that's a good thing. Another myth on this is everybody goes on and on about reels. Okay, most of the time the reel does nothing other than just holds your line, okay? Steelhead fishers control yourself. Carp fishing, steelhead fishing, salmon fishing, these big fish, the reel becomes quite important because you do use the drag somewhat for those fish. I don't want to tell you how many times I've fished for carp and my drag, I'm not even using my drag, I'm just using my hand on the bottom. So you can use your hand too, but the reel is the least important part of the whole system. And you can spend a lot of money on reels. Okay, you can spend a lot of money on reels. Lines. The line is probably one of the most important things you'll have on your rod and reel. I typically always just use a weight forward line. If I want it to go underwater, I have some extra little pieces that I put on the end that can sink. So I don't really even get these sinking I mean, you can get a line for everything, but I'll get a weight forward line. Okay, that's where you want to start. And then the last thing I want to talk about is old rods versus new rods. And again, I have a lot of people go, I got this rod, that was my grandpa's, and it was like the most expensive rod in 1958 or something like that. Well, I'll tell you, the rod technology sort of really reached a peak maybe about 10 years ago. And there's not a whole lot difference between a cheap rod can be really, really well made now. And the rods I use for teaching my classes are these. The whole setup with the rod reel line and everything is $79. And those are as better than some of the Orvis rods I bought back in the 90s. Way better, actually. So trying to start to fish with some of these old rods can be just really quite difficult. The new rods just cast beautifully, they're light. And again, that's where you're going to pay a little bit more too. The lighter rods tend to be more expensive, but you know, a little bit here and there, it's not going to make that much difference. So rather than fighting with some old rod that might have a 30-year-old line on it too, you know, it's better to go to a shop and spend a little bit of money and, you know, and get something, you know, like newer. It can be a cheap rod. It can be like $100 rod, and with a new line and everything, you'll probably do a whole lot better. So that's what I had to say about this. I just had to clear up a few things, and that's my opinion. You know, there's people that love the details of all this. I tend to be a generalist, but if you have some issues with anything, please feel free to comment. The more knowledge, the better. All right, we'll see you.